Thank you. Testing 1, 2, 3. Thank you. You know, I dreamed for decades about writing a book, and I thought it would just be the greatest thing to write a book and walk into a bookstore and see the book that I had written. And when I found that my office is in New York on Rockefeller Center on 6th Avenue, and when I heard that the book had shown up in the Barnes & Noble, because we don't have pals in Manhattan, in the Barnes & Noble on 5th Avenue, I made my way over there, and I walked in, and I found my book, and I immediately was so disappointed because it wasn't on one of these tables. I think that you can dream about something, and when you get it, my satisfaction lasted about as long as a Beatles song from like the early Beatles, before they started singing long songs, because immediately I just began thinking about what was wrong and how unhappy I was. And so I'm so happy to be at Pals where they're giving it terrific table space. It's the first time I've seen it, and I really appreciate it. When I told people that I was working on this book, I could tell that they were thinking two things. Steve must really know a lot of math and data stuff, A, and B, at some point I'm probably going to get guilt-tripped into coming to a thing at Powell's and listening to it and buying that book, but I would never read that book that he's talking about writing. And I would like to tell you that this book is written for anybody who thought that this book is written for you. I tried to make it. The Numerati don't need this book. They already know what they're doing. This is for the people that don't really know that much about what the Numerati are up to. And so I tried to make it fun. The idea for this book came up at a Business Week meeting where I pitched the cover story on America's tech industry. And what I said was that the United States tech industry was going to decline because we were graduating fewer engineers than India and China and other key countries. We were behind in broadband, behind in wireless. So I had this whole thesis about why our tech industry was going to decline. I thought it was a really important story, and I delivered it with passion, and the editors all yawned. They said, "We've heard that story before. It sounds like Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. Give us something new." So I said, "Well, it's actually really important, so let's talk about it." So we talked about it, and one of the editors finally said, "You know, at the heart of all of these strategic issues is math." And at that point, the editor-in-chief's eyes lit up, and he said, "Math? We could do a cover story on math. Nobody writes about math. People will buy that." And so the science editor said, "Well, we have a couple people on staff, despite the fact that most journalists don't know anything about math. We have a couple who actually do." And the editor-in-chief said, no, let's give it to a less brainy person. So I got the assignment, and I began digging around in the world of math. I went to MIT, I went to Carnegie Mellon, I talked to mathematicians at Bell Labs. They were talking to me about factoring and all these things that were very new to me. And after about a month, I realized I didn't have any story. I really didn't know much about math, and I certainly didn't know enough to write a story for Business Week. And then I went to IBM Research. And at IBM, I met a guy who's a mathematician, a Syrian mathematician, whose specialty is stochastic analysis, which I didn't really understand. I didn't know what that was. But he told me that what he was doing, he and his team were gathering all kinds of data from 50,000 of their colleagues, and they were trying to build predictive mathematical models of their colleagues so that they could predict what their colleagues would do, which jobs they'd do the best, which teams they'd work best in. And I thought, if these guys can model their colleagues, and I only vaguely knew what a model was, then other people in other realms might be able to model us as shoppers and voters and patients and potential terrorists. And the whole thing came into focus for me. And I attained what I consider a state of ignorant euphoria. I said, I am going to write the ultimate story on the mathematical modeling of humanity. And I called up my old college roommate who has a a PhD in computer science. And I got his voicemail. And I said, Neil, I just got out of IBM. I just learned about this project they're doing. I'm going to do the mathematical modeling of humanity. It's going to be a National Magazine award-winning story. And I went on and on for maybe 2 minutes into his voicemail, and then I hung up and forgot that I'd made that call. And a couple weeks later, I was on the West Coast, and I was going to go see Google, and I was in my car, and I get this call from my roommate. And he says, I'm very worried about that story you told me about. I said, why? He said, have you ever heard of garbage in, garbage out? I'd heard the term. He said, have you ever heard the story about the drunk who's looking for a key under a lamppost? I imagine some of you have heard this story, but I'll tell it for those who haven't. There's a drunk who's on his hands and knees late at night under a lamppost, and somebody stops and says, what are you looking for? He says, my key. And they said, where did you drop it? And he points down a dark alley and says, over there. They said, well, why are you looking here? He said, because this is where the light is. And the idea for data mining is that people might use the data that they can find, even though it doesn't represent the truth and it's not that important, and they'll use that because they have it at hand. And that's what Neil was telling me. So a half hour later, I'm at Google, and I'm talking to Craig Silverstein, who is the #1 employee at Google. He was the guy that Larry and Sergey hired because he knew about search and they didn't. So I'm talking to him, and I say, do you know that story about the drunk and the key and the lamppost? He goes, of course I know that story. Is it relevant to what I'm doing? He said, well, let me just tell you a story. When I was in middle school, and this is Google's #1 employee, I did this science fair experiment, and I came up with this fabulous data. And then I realized that the experiment was flawed. So I had to come up with another experiment that would fit the data that I already had. I said, okay, this guy works for Google. If the mathematical modeling of humanity is going to happen, it's going to happen first in areas where people can afford to make lots and lots of mistakes. And so it's going to happen in areas like marketing and advertising, where if you don't understand somebody, you think you have them all figured out, and you give them an advertisement, and it's not right for them at all. But who cares? It's not a big deal. And if in those industries like Google, you do it just a little bit better than the people before you, you can make a lot of money. Google makes a lot of money trying to understand us and giving us the advertisements that they think fit us. And some of them, as you know, are just ludicrous. But enough of them work so that they make a ton of money and have become a giant in advertising and in computers. So despite Neil's caution and Craig's story, I actually believe my original thesis. I believe that we are going into this mathematical modeling of humanity, and that these people who I call the Numerati are looking at our data, and what they're looking at now are just trickles of data compared to the rivers that we're going to be creating in the coming decades as we surround ourselves with more and more electronics